de Medici.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
In following Clement VII's history to his death, we have had to neglect for a time the younger members of the family, who during the last few years of his life were beginning to play their parts in the drama of the Medici story. These present to us a group of four, 2 young men and 2 girls, 3 of them belonging to the family, while the 4th entered it by marriage. These occupy a considerable portion of the stage during the years 1530 to 1537. The 2 young men destined to meet with early deaths. The 2 girls destined to have long lives and to fill important places in history. They are Ippolito, the son of Giuliano, Duke de Nemours; Alessandro, whose dubious parentage has been already noticed; Catherine, the only child of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino; and Margaret, a daughter of the Emperor Charles V, who at 15 became the wife of Alessandro. Ippolito, as the eldest of the group, must be considered first, while Catherine, being so important a personage, must be dealt with separately. Ippolito, the son of the justly esteemed Giuliano, Duke de Nemours, appeals to us both on account of his own attractive personality and the sadness of his history. Born in 1509, and only 7 years old when his father died, he was as a child taken charge of by his uncle, Pope Leo X, who was very fond of him and watched carefully over his education, delighting in the ability which from an early age he displayed. But Leo died when Ippolito was only 12 years old. We have seen how when he was 15, he was sent from Rome by Pope Clement VII to reside in Florence, made a member of the government, and looked upon by all as intended, when old enough, to succeed to the rule of Florence, which had been held by his father. During the next 3 years, he, with Alessandro and the child Catherine, remained at Florence under Cardinal Passerini's charge, living in the Medici palace, until, when Ippolito was 18, the 3rd banishment of the family took place. Ippolito thereupon became, for a time, a wanderer, but when Pope Clement got back to Rome at the end of 1528, Ippolito also returned there. Ippolito was, by this time, 20 years of age, handsome, courteous, good-natured, highly cultivated, possessed of much ability, and a universal favorite. Varchi says of him that he was gifted with every accomplishment, affable and pleasant in his manner, and most liberal to all who excelled in war or letters or in any of the liberal arts, while another quality which the contemporary writers constantly speak of as possessed by him is that of royal-mindedness. Towards the end of the year 1529, Clement VII began to form a plan of supplanting Ippolito as the future ruler of Florence by Alessandro. This was the more unpardonable in that Ippolito was eminently qualified for that position, while Alessandro, being uneducated, vicious, and universally detested, was as conspicuously unfit for it. Clement began privately to carry out this scheme when making the secret treaty with Charles V at Bologna in December 1529, the 3rd and 4th items of which treaty provided for this arrangement. These intentions were, however, kept concealed from all concerned, except the emperor, until Florence should first be subdued and Ippolito disposed of elsewhere. In the spring of 1531, after the siege of Florence had ended, but while the Pope's intentions had not yet been allowed to transpire, Ippolito, Alessandro, and Catherine were all once more together in Rome, Ippolito being then 22 and Catherine 12, and the idea of these two becoming united in marriage began by some to be entertained, but their common guardian, Pope Clement, had other plans for both of them. He intended to use Catherine as the bait by which to secure the alliance with the King of France, which he desired as a defense against the thraldom of the emperor, while he had reasons for his own for intending that Alessandro, and not Ippolito, should be Duke of Florence. So, while during the early part of 1531 affairs in Florence were left to be carried on by the provisional government under Valois, Clement completed his arrangements for making it equally impossible for Ippolito to become Duke of Florence and to marry Catherine. Ippolito's natural bent was towards the profession of a soldier, and he disliked everything connected with the ecclesiastical life and the ways and modes of thought of the ecclesiastics, among whom the greater part of his boyhood and youth had been passed. Clement, however, who managed these young scions of the family like pawns on a chessboard, and had numberless ways of forcing them to conform to his will, now proceeded to carry out his object as regards Ippolito by conferring on him the dignity of a cardinal. Ippolito violently refused to accept the proposed honor, but eventually was forced to submit, though he never would wear the cardinal's dress when he could help it, and to get him out of the way was dispatched on a political mission to Hungary. This done, Clement sent Alessandro to Florence, where in July he was declared head of the Republic, and 10 months later, while Ippolito was still absent in Hungary, the Republic was abolished, and Alessandro declared Duke of Florence, May 1532. Alessandro, installed as absolute ruler of Florence at the age of 20, Alessandro showed all the inherent evil of his nature. There is only one example in Florence of the plain ducal coronet. It is to be seen surmounting Alessandro's name over the door leading into the Ognissanti cloisters in the Via Borgo Ognissanti. And sore reason had Florence to look with hatred on that sign of her subjugation. There followed the 5 most shameful years of her history, the exaltation of this foul and evil youth to a position of power, absolutely uncontrolled, showed mankind an example of what human nature is capable of under such conditions. His sycophantic admirer, Ceccaregli, in his Azioni e Sentenze, credits him with wit and wisdom, a fine sense of justice, and judgments which would have done honor to a Solomon. But if this was the case, it was combined with other qualities which obliterated all such considerations. An historian of his own time calls him a creature who would have disgraced even the deadliest epochs of Roman villainy, while another describes him as one whose excesses were as controllable by human reason as those of a beast of the forest. None dare defend him or refuse him anything, lest he should murder those dearest to them. Trollope says, "The portraits of this wretched youth, which hang on the walls of the Florentine gallery, show the lowness of the type to which his organization belonged. The small, contracted features, the low forehead, and mean expression are altogether unlike any of the Medici race, in whom, whatever else they might be, there was always manifestation of intellectual power. His life was one continued orgy. The ministers to his lawless will were ruffians, chosen from among the vilest of mankind, and these men were made not only the ministers to, but the companions of his pleasures, and the companions also of the young, the wealthy, and the beautiful among the aristocracy of Florence. What wonder that disgust and indignation at being subjected to such a rule was the prevailing temper of Florence, or that after 3 years an appeal should have been made to the emperor to remove so infamous a vassal. The wonder rather is that any city should have endured such a monster so long, and should not have deprived him of life within the first year instead of the 6th. The experience was a more bitter one to Florence than it would have been to other cities. Others had had tyrannies to endure. Florence had never known the rule of a tyrant. The experience killed her very soul for a time. Margaret. In the spring of 1533, when Alessandro had been for about a year Duke of Florence, the 4th member of the group, Margaret, then a girl of 12, fair and pretty, and engaged to Alessandro in accordance with Clement's compact with the emperor, passed through Florence on her way to Naples. Born in Flanders in 1521, she had been brought up by her 2 aunts, Margaret of Austria and Maria of Hungary, and was now sent by her father, the emperor's orders, to reside at Naples until the time should come for her marriage to Alessandro. Catherine, 2 years older, who was then in Florence preparatory to her departure from Marseille for her own marriage, rode out to meet her at the Medici Via of Cafoggiolo, in the valley of the Mugello, on the road from Faenza. And thence, on the 16th April, 1533, these 2 girls, so different in appearance, and destined to have such very different histories, together rode to Florence. Margaret remained for a few days to be shown by Catherine the principal sights of the city, and then continued her journey. For the next 3 years, Margaret remained at Naples, and as Alessandro's enormities yearly grew more notorious, there began to be doubts, especially after the death of Pope Clement, whether her marriage would take place. So iniquitous did such a marriage seem, even in that age, that the Fioriusiti did not believe in the projected marriage, because they did not believe that the princess could be given to a man so infamous. However, Charles V evidently thought otherwise, and even Pope Clement's death did not cause him to alter his intention to carry out the marriage which had been settled upon between them. Ippolito. Although the way he had been treated caused a great change in Ippolito, a permanent sadness coming over a disposition which had before been full of brightness, we do not hear of his showing any resentment. He developed a great liking for the Hungarians and for Hungary, and while in that country was fond of wearing the Hungarian dress, though on one occasion while there he was made prisoner under a mistake, a matter over which Pope Clement suffered much humiliation. On his return from Hungary, Ippolito took up his abode at Bologna, and shortly afterwards complied with the Pope's request that he should accompany him to Marseilles to be present at Catherine's marriage. At Bologna, Ippolito lived in great style, and an incident connected with his life there gives an example of his character. Clement VII, thinking the number of retainers maintained by Ippolito excessive, remonstrated with him, whereupon Ippolito replied, "No, I do not maintain them because I have need of their services, but because they have need of mine." Ippolito had all the family taste for learning. He wrote various poems, and translated the second book of the Aeneid into Italian blank verse, a work of which has been highly praised and often reprinted. In 1534, Pope Clement being ill, Ippolito returned to Rome, and was with the Pope when he died in September, on which occasion we hear of his protecting the latter's body from insult, while it was he who thereupon commenced the construction of the tombs in St. Maria sopra Minerva, to the two Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII. Perhaps we shall not be wrong in considering that Ippolito showed the nobility of his character in nothing more strongly than in never exhibiting any malice towards Pope Clement for the way in which the latter had cheated him and ruined his life. Yet he evidently felt it deeply, for Varchi tells us, when he understood that Pope Clement had decided that Alessandro was to be made the heir to the riches and greatness of the house of Medici, and not himself, a great change took place in him. He was seized with immense anger and grief, as it seemed to him that being older, a nearer relation to the Pope, and better endowed by nature, so rich an inheritance and so brilliant a marriage, should rather be his, either not knowing or refusing to believe the secret rumors that Alessandro was the son of Clement. It is peculiar to notice how it is assumed as a matter of course that nearness of relationship to the Pope, and not right of primogeniture, as a grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, is that which should constitute Ippolito's stronger claim. Contemporary historical events, 1534 through 1535. On Clement VII's death, Alessandro Farnese was, on the 11th October, 1534, elected Pope in a conclave which only lasted 1 hour. He took the name of Paul III, and within 3 days of his election, he ordered a committee to assemble to draw up a scheme for the reformation of the Church, and to consider the time, place, and mode for the assembly of a general council. In politics, also the new Pope adopted a totally different course from that of his predecessor, endeavoring to assuage the animosity between Charles and Francis, and maintaining a position of neutrality between them. The above course of action on the part of the Pope changed the entire political situation, while it enabled the Emperor to turn his attention to the affairs of Germany and to resisting the formidable encroachments of the Turks. In May 1535, Charles V sailed with a great fleet from Barcelona to attack the Barbary pirates, who under their commander, Shereddin Barbarossa, had established themselves in Algiers and Tunis, and ravaged the coasts of Spain and Italy. The pirates were defeated, and Charles took their capital, Tunis, and in August returned in triumph to Sicily. Ippolito. In June 1535, Pope Clement being dead, and Alessandro, having in the 3 years he had been in power so outraged the Florentines that he had driven a large number of them into voluntary exile, these Fuoriceti determined to send an embassy to the Emperor Charles V to appeal to him against the atrocities of his vassal, and to petition for his removal. The Fuoriceti had always been a recognized party in Florentine politics, as whichever party was in power caused a number of the opposite party to quit Florence, either voluntarily for their own safety or by being exiled. But under Alessandro's evil tyranny, they had come to muster unusually strong. They selected Ippolito as their ambassador to lay their petition before the emperor, the latter being then at Tunis on his expedition against the Barbary pirates. Ippolito, who was then at Rome, started upon this journey and got as far as Itri, near Gaetia, between Rome and Naples. But while waiting there for a vessel in which to embark for Tunis, he was poisoned. And the proof was overwhelming that it was done by Alessandro. The agent employed was one Giovanni Andrea of Borgo San Sepolcro, and besides the universal opinion and the testimony of other historians, Varchi gives proof, which is practically conclusive, that he was employed to commit the crime by Alessandro. Thus died, at the age of 26, the accomplished and deservedly popular Ippolito, put out of life, like so many others, by the detestable youth whom Clement VII had placed in power in Florence. The assassin, Giovanni Andrea, did not long survive. After effecting his escape from Ippolito's servants, who in their rage would have torn him in pieces, he fled to Florence and lived for some months in Alessandro's palace, protected by the latter. Thence, after a time, he went to his own town of Borgo San Sepolcro, but there the people, in an outburst of popular indignation at his crime in killing one so universally admired as Ippolito, seized him and stoned him to death. As we look at Titian's portrait of this handsome and accomplished grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, we see his whole character and history laid bare before us. Though a cardinal, he will not be painted in that hated dress, but wears his favorite Hungarian costume, and the sword which he would have liked to bear as a soldier. His chivalrous spirit, high temper, quick intelligence, and that quality of royal-mindedness which those around saw in him, are well brought out by the painter. The picture was painted after that great change in him of which Varchi speaks, and his face may well have that look of permanent sadness, since, too wholly in the power of his crafty relative the Pope to resist after the thing was done, he had by various subterfuges had his whole life spoilt. Titian was at this time at the height of his fame, the greatest portrait painter in Europe, and much in request at all the most splendid courts. He had passed from the patronage of the Duke of Mantua to that of the Emperor Charles V, whose admiration for him was exemplified in his speech on picking up Titian's brush from the ground, declaring that a Titian might well be served by Caesar. In order to give a high relief to the head Titian was fond of using, as in this instance a black background in his portraits, Ruskin, speaking of them, says, "Both for what they present and the manner of their presentation, Titian's portraits are among the artistic marvels of the world." Contemporary historical events, 1536. In January 1536, war again broke out between Charles and Francis, while the latter brought another powerful adversary into their conflict by concluding an alliance with the Turkish Sultan Suleiman. The French overran the whole of Savoy and took Turin. Charles, then resting in Naples after his North African expedition, remained there from December 1535 to March 1536. He then traveled northwards to oppose the French, and in passing through Rome made arrangements with Paul III for the assembly of a council of the Church as soon as a state of peace should be obtained, though it was 9 years before the council was able to assemble. Having arrived in northern Italy, Charles repulsed the French and then invaded Provence, but in September was forced to retire again to Italy, Savoy remaining the prize of France, and the territories of its duke becoming reduced to the single town of Nice. Alessandro. Whether or not Alessandro's enormities had become so pronounced before Pope Clement's death in 1534 They evidently had fully done so by June 1535, when Ippolito's mission took place. It therefore immeasurably lowers our esteem of the Emperor Charles V, who must have been fully aware both of the abominable state of things which had caused Ippolito to be sent, and of the circumstances of his death, to find that in April 1536, on his way northwards from Rome, he stayed in Florence at the Medici Palace with Alessandro, and on the 19th June, in the same year Alessandro was married in San Lorenzo to the Emperor's daughter Margaret, then 15, the last iniquitous step in the compact made by Clement VII with Charles V at Bologna in 1530. But all was of no avail. 6 months later, on the night of the 5th January 1537, came the end of Alessandro's vicious life at the age of 26, and in the way in which it was bound to come sooner or later. He was assassinated by his young relative and boon companion, Lorenzino, of the younger branch of the Medici family, then aged 22, assisted by a hired assassin, Scoronconzolo, in a room in Lorenzino's house adjoining the Medici Palace, to which house Alessandro had gone late at night, imagining that he would meet there a lady of whom he was enamored, and who was none other than Lorenzino's own sister, Laodomia, the young widow of Alamanno Salviati, who, we are told, was as virtuous as she was beautiful, and who had previously rejected the Duke's odious attentions with scorn. Lorenzino, however, was merely deluding him, and instead of his sister, brought in the assassin, Scoronconzolo, and together they put an end to the detestable being who had for 5 years outraged Florence. Lorenzino was a strange youth. He was the eldest of the 4 children of Pier Francesco, the younger, and Maria Soderini, and had decided ability and character, while it is specially recorded of him that he had much culture and literary talent. But he is said to have acted at times as though seized with temporary madness. On one occasion, when in Rome, he, although a great admirer of antiquities, in a sudden freak knocked off the heads of several fine statues of the Emperor Hadrian, at which act Pope Clement was furious, threatened to hang him, and banished him from Rome. He was 17 when Alessandro was made Duke of Florence, and from that time he became the latter's constant associate and companion in all his vicious courses. His devoted mother, the widowed Maria Soderini, did her utmost to lead her eldest son into better ways, and to get him to break off his connection with Alessandro, but unsuccessfully, a failure accounted for by Lorenzino in his defense by his statement that his conduct had had a deliberate object. His sister, Laodomia, was a celebrated beauty of the time. Her portrait, painted by Bronzino, is to be seen in the Accademia delle Belle Arti, Florence. Leaving Alessandro's body where it lay, Lorenzino forthwith took horse and fled from Florence, riding hard through the night for Bologna. Next morning, the Duke's servants, finding him absent, suspected foul play. Search was secretly made for him, and at evening they discovered his body, lying in the room in Lorenzino's house. His death was kept secret, and the body hurriedly conveyed by night into the little church of San Giovannino, close to the Medici Palace. There it was prepared for burial, and on the following night was carried by a few servants, with great secrecy, to the church of San Lorenzo, and without any religious service was hurriedly placed in the sarcophagus containing the remains of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, neither wife, relative, nor friend of any sort being present at this dishonored interment. After halting a few hours in Bologna, Lorenzino fled on to Venice, where was then living Filippo Strozzi, who was at this time the leading man among the Fuorositi. When on reaching Venice, Lorenzino burst into Strozzi's room, and related what he had done. Strozzi embraced him, calling him the deliverer of his country, and the Florentine Brutus. Strozzi's delight was so great that he declared that his 2 sons should marry Lorenzino's 2 sisters, which was in a short time carried out. Piero Strozzi marrying Laodomia, and Roberto Strozzi marrying Maddalena. Lorenzino's act has been the subject of much controversy. By some, he has been considered the liberator of his country from an intolerable state of things, for which there was no other remedy since appeals to the emperor had proved useless. By others, he has been called a traitor and a regicide. Possibly it would be necessary for us to have to live under such a tyranny as Alessandro's before we could form a just opinion on the point. Be that as it may, praises were lavished upon Lorenzino from every side, and both the Florentines in exile throughout Italy and those within the city compared him to all the heroes of patriotism in history. There are only three possible motives for his act: personal ambition, the liberation of his country, and the protection of his family from insult. None have considered that he was moved by the first of these motives. He was, it is true, the rightful heir to the position in which Clement VII had placed Alessandro, but he never seemed to care for such a position, and was entirely without any family influence to enable him to profit by Alessandro's death, almost his only male relative being an unknown and equally powerless youth of 17. In the detailed defense of his act, which he drew up, he stated that his whole course of action had been a deliberate plan in order to free his country from a monstrous tyranny which had become insupportable, and this account of the matter is believed by historians to be the true one, even though it involves the possession by Lorenzino of an amount of determination beyond his years. But while the above motive on public grounds was that put forward by Lorenzino, he had a no less powerful private one, even though he, naturally enough, did not wish to state it, for in the circumstances under which Florence was at that time, this youth of 22 had certainly no other way by which he could protect the honor of his sister. As a mark of ignominy, Cosimo I, on succeeding to the rule of Florence, caused Lorenzino's house to be entirely destroyed. It has in recent times often been declared that Cosimo, on pulling down the house, opened in the place where it had stood a narrow street or alley connecting the Via Larga, now Via Cavour, with the Via Ginori, and called it the Strada del Traditori. But this is disproved by the very rare work in the State Archives, the Ricerche alle Casi di Frenzi, anno 1561, a record very carefully compiled of every house in Florence at that date, carried out block by block from corner to corner of the 4 streets enclosing each block. This shows with great exactness, first, that there was no street or alley near the Medici Palace running from the Via Larga to the Via Ginori, and second, that in 1561 the house of Lorenzino had been not merely spoilt, but entirely destroyed. This record, in regard to the Quartiere San Giovanni, starting from the corner at the intersection at the Via de' Gori with the Via Larga, mentions first the house of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici Palace, and then says that the next house is a ruin, that which formerly belonged to Lorenzino de Medici, already entirely destroyed, rovinato, while it mentions no street or alley running from the Via Larga to the Via Ginori. This proves that there was then, at all events, no Strada del Traditori, while it also disposes of another theory which has been held, viz. That Lorenzino's house was that which is now number 5, Via Cavour. The former site of Lorenzino's house is, in fact, covered by the northern portion of the Medici Palace, which was added by the Riccardi family when they bought the palace in 1659, part of which addition has an empty space left on the first floor, in accordance with one of the conditions of the sale, which in giving permission to the Riccardi family to build the proposed extension of the palace, on the site laid down the condition that such a space should be left above the ground floor at this spot, as a memorial of the murder of Alessandro, which had taken place in a room similarly situated. Until the year 1875, though it was always known that Alessandro's body had been interred in the tomb of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, it was a debated question which of the 2 tombs in the new sacristy was that of Lorenzo, and which that of his uncle Giuliano. In that year, however, the Italian government authorized an investigation to settle the point, and the sarcophagus over which sits the figure called Il Pensieroso was opened, in the presence of a representative of the government and various literary men interested. It proved to contain, says the account, 2 corpses, which turned to dust as soon as the air was admitted, but not before the figure of Alessandro had been perfectly recognized, both by its mulatto type and by the marks of the wounds, especially those in the face, which he had received from Lorenzino and the hired assassin, Scoranconsolo. Another account denies the turning into dust, and says that there were signs of embalmment, that the two bodies were lying head to foot, and that Lorenzo's was clothed in the usual black garment, but Alessandro's in an embroidered shirt. Mr. Charles Heath Wilson, who was present, remarked that one of the cheekbones of the latter body bore traces of a stab, and that this corroborated Varchi's account of the murder. Margaret. When the tragedy of Alessandro's murder occurred, Margaret, not knowing what might be the consequences to herself of the removal of a husband so justly detested by every soul in Florence, fled at once to the Fortezza, which was held by the troops of her father, the emperor. Thence she departed first to Prato, and then to Pisa, and after a short time, by the emperor's orders, removed to Spain. There, 8 years later, she was at the age of 24, forced to marry a boy of 13, Ottavio Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III, and became, in afterlife, a very capable and celebrated woman, who, as Margaret of Parma, was in 1559 made regent of the Netherlands by her half-brother, Philip II, and ruled that country well under the most difficult circumstances for 8 years. In 1567 she insisted on resigning that rule because she would not be a party to the inhuman measures which Philip had sent the Duke of Alva to the Netherlands to carry out, her last act being to write Philip begging him to temper justice with mercy. Amidst general expressions of regret, she retired from the Netherlands to her home in Parma, where she died in 1586. Margaret was the last mistress of the family palace in the Via Larga. Contessina de Bardi, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Clarice Orsini, Alfonsina Orsini, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, and Margaret herself had each in turn ruled as its mistress, and when the last of them fled from it in terror, the palace where so many momentous events in the history of Florence had taken place ceased to be occupied by the head of the family, giving place to a palace, grander indeed in size, but unable to compete with its predecessor in the magnitude of the associations which the latter gathers round it. On Alessandro's death, Clement VII's scheme for keeping the rule of Florence in the elder branch came abruptly to an end, since all of that branch, except Catherine, were dead, and the succession passed to the younger branch, as it should properly have done on the death of Leo X. All the falseness, injustice, baseness, and treachery employed in order to seat Alessandro on a throne to which he had no right had produced nothing whatever so far as keeping the younger branch out of power in Florence was concerned. Entirely defeating its own aim, Clement's action had only rendered it more easy for them both to gain that power and to make it a despotism. But before we proceed to take up the history of this younger branch, we have still to follow that of the third member of this group of 4 young people, the daughter of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, with whom Cosimo's branch ended, and who had the longest and most important history of any of the family.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.